have doubled my knitting output this year of 2025. That's right, doubled. We're rounding up a little bit, but we're going to say that I doubled it. And today I'm going to tell you how I did it. Okay, so I'm rounding up a little bit, but I practically doubled my knitting in 2025 compared to 2024. And today I'm going to tell you the 5 tips that help me do that. Hello and welcome to Knit Cheek. My name is Natalie and I am the cheek behind Knit Cheek, and today we're going to talk about 5 tips on how to increase your knitting output. This year, 2025, has been incredible for my knitting, and I'm going to share how I practically doubled my knitting from 2024 to 2025. This is not my everything that I knit in 2025 video. I'm not going to be breaking down my projects or going into detail about any of them today. I will post that video soon, and that video will be linked in the description as well. We're just going to talk about the things that I did differently that increased my knitting output. Doubling my knitting wasn't about rushing or overworking myself or overdoing it. It was more about balance, knitting by mood, and a little bit of organization. First, let's go into some stats and talk about what I mean when I say I doubled my knitting, because there is a little bit of a caveat here. I will link my Everything I Made in 2024 video if you would like to check that out. And like I said, I will also link my 2025 video once I have filmed it. I finished 16 projects in 2024 and I finished 26 projects in 2025. That is 10 projects more in 2025 than 2024. I worked on 18 projects in 2024 and I worked on 32 projects in 2025, and that's where I got my number of I almost doubled my knitting, was by the projects that I worked on because of a couple of factors. Number one, I still have 2 weeks left to potentially finish some knitting. Also, I think that that number is more important to me than finished objects, even though maybe you might disagree that the finished objects are what is important. I definitely knit more in 2025. Let's talk about some more details on those numbers. So in 2024, I finished 6 garments, and in 2025, I finished 10 garments. That's quite a bit more. In 2024, I finished 10 accessories, 4 being socks. And in 2025, I knit 12 accessories, 7 being socks. I knit 3 gifts in 2024 and 4 gifts in 2025. Let's talk about unfinished whips. So in 2024, I had 2 unfinished whips. And in 2025, I have 6 unfinished whips. All 6 of those whips are like 75% done. I do feel like if we were to add that 6 onto my total finished, we would be at 32, which would almost be double my knitting. So if I could finish all 6 of my whips by New Year's, we could actually say that I doubled my knitting. I don't think that's going to happen. I think I might finish 2 more whips if I focus. I did not frog any projects in 2024, and I frogged and gave up on 1 project in 2025. And then both years I crocheted 1 item. I just tend to be a 1 crochet project a year. I don't know why. Just that type of grandma. Now that we went over the stats, let's briefly touch on my 5 tips before we break each one down. So tip number 1 is to have an organized queue. Tip number 2 is to be a polyamorous knitter, which is the opposite of a monogamous knitter. Tip number 3 is to enhance your stash, and this is going to look different for everybody, but we'll go over that. Tip number 4 is to be flexible. And tip number 5 is community, and that's knit-alongs or buddy knits. I'm going to break each one of these tips down and how I use them in my knitting practice. There will also be timestamps in the description if you want to jump around or if you're only interested in some of these tips. All right, let's break down some of these tips. Tip number 1 is to organize your queue. And if you've watched my last 2 videos, I kind of did a deep dive on reorganizing my stash, clearing out my queue, and then I did a queue tour as well to show the finished results. And this is something that I did do throughout the year of 2025, but it does require some maintenance. So the last time I did it, I cleared it out again and then re-entered everything. But throughout the year, I have tried to keep my queue consistent with yarn that I actually have in my stash and that I was ready to knit. This year, 2025, I had so many waves of cast-on-itis, and the way that I was able to handle that and keep my brain organized from like this overwhelming sense of wanting to make everything was to keep my Ravelry queue organized by what I wanted to cast on in the near future. So instead of randomly casting on things because the internet made me feel like I had like a little line of things in my queue that I knew I could cast on to help me feel like I was casting on all the things. And I am okay with having multiple whips, as you will see. Even if you are a monogamous knitter, I think that this tip will really help you to increase your knitting output because you are going to be a little bit more organized with your plans. This is my only tip that has to do with organization, I promise, but I do think that it's really prevalent to helping you in keeping your thoughts organized and will ultimately lead to more knitting. To summarize, what I did when I cleared out my queue was that I cleared it out of anything that I did not have yarn for or wasn't planning on casting on in the near future. If you are someone who has 200 plus patterns in your queue, I see you. I know that happens. I know that it can be overwhelming to try to clear that out. I'm going to link my stash video in the description, which is going to give you tons of tips on how to make that easier. For example, like making a bundle in your Ravelry called Add to Queue Next. And that's something you can do. You can literally move everything in your queue into that bundle. And then that way you can deal with it later, but then just move 5 to 10 patterns back into your queue to give you like peace of mind. Again, it's something that I have had to do multiple times throughout the year just to keep my brain on track, and things will change. I'll be like, I don't want to knit this anymore right now, so I'll put that to the back burner. Or something new and shiny comes up and I want to knit it soon, so I add that to my queue. Maybe I switch the yarn that I had planned for another project to a different project. That happens all the time. Yarn doesn't always work out to a pattern if you're not buying the suggested yarn, and you have to be able to be flexible. We're going to come back to that one. I just reorganized my queue and I feel so much better. I feel like 2026 is going to be another great year for knitting. Tip number 2 is probably my favorite because it's a little scandalous, and that is polyamorous knitting. And polyamorous is the opposite of monogamous. When you use it in the term of a relationship, a monogamous person is in a relationship with one other person, whereas a polyamorous person has multiple partners. A lot of people identify as being monogamous knitters. In the past, that was me. I was a monogamous knitter. I was a one project at a time, and I didn't like the feeling of casting something off until my last project was done. And that's something that I find is common with me with projects and things in my life. I really like to complete things before I start new things. So the idea of being a polyamorous knitter made me uncomfortable. I didn't like it. I didn't want to start something new. But once I did, I really loved having multiple projects. I really feel like it is really good for knitting output and also just to make knitting easier for you, which sounds crazy if you're a monogamous knitter. I understand that because I've been there. Let's talk about how to introduce polyamorous knitting if you are a traditional monogamous knitter. So if you like one project at a time, maybe just try slow by throwing in a second project. And you want to make sure this project is different from your main project. So you've got your main project and your side piece project. And if your main project is an all over cabled sweater, then maybe your second project should be something mindless and in the round. This is going to be a really common theme of how I balance my knitting. I like to have multiple projects at different stages, but when you're getting started, 2 should be a good way to dip your toe into polyamorous knitting. And from there, you can kind of go into maybe being a little bit more brave and adding a few more projects until you work your way up. I have worked my way up to being comfortable with having 8 to 10 projects, which sounds insane to me, but I definitely know there are YouTubers on this platform who are balancing more whips than that, so it's not unheard of. As somebody who has 6 to 10 whips at any given time, you are going to have whips that fall to the back burner, waist side, whatever. They're going to, how I like to put it, hibernate. This is a term that I think comes from Ravelry because Ravelry allows you to hibernate your whips. And so that means that there may be a whip that you don't work on for a while. For me to hibernate a whip, I need to know that I'm not going to touch it for like a month, and then I will hibernate it in my brain and in Ravelry. I did this when I went to New York because I was gone for a month. It was really easy to put some of my projects in hibernation because I didn't bring them with me. If this makes you uncomfortable, I totally get it. It sounds crazy, but it's actually really, really cool that in 3 months you can pull out a project that's like halfway done. Half of it's done. Now you just have to finish it. It's actually really, really nice. It feels like kind of cheating or like you got to cut in line. All I will say about that is you definitely want to take notes about where you left off, if there was a mistake you made and that's why you hibernated it, or if you made any modifications to that pattern that you might not remember, so you can't just pull the pattern up. If you take the needles out, make sure you note what needles you were using. You think you're going to remember, but you don't. So just make sure to take notes on your projects that you plan on hibernating. This is honestly one of the biggest contributors of why I knit so much more than I used to, and that is allowing myself to have multiple whips. Honestly, allowing myself to have multiple projects has probably been the biggest factor of why I can knit more than I used to. It's just so nice to have a variety. I like to have mindless projects, projects that are stockinette in the round, intense cables or lace work. I also like to have projects that are at different stages. Like if I have a sweater that I am currently working through the upper body shaping, it's nice to have another sweater where I'm done with that and I'm just working the body or the ribbing or the sleeves. Another thing that I think could be cool is to knit a top down and a bottom up sweater at the same time because you're at 2 different places. The variety definitely helps when you get off work and you're tired and you want to knit something mindless, you've got something, or if you're fresh in the morning and you want to knit something that takes a little bit more brain space, you have a project for that as well. Another tip that I have about having multiple whips is to somehow organize that. And I have a video that breaks down how to organize multiple whips when you have too many. And I go over how to use Rabbit, how to use your Notes app, your Photos app, or how to just use a pad and paper to make sure that you're keeping track of all of your current whips. And I will link that in the description below. Let's get into my next tip, which is enhancing your stash. So this year, in the beginning of the year, I let myself buy yarn without a plan, and I bought yarn that I knew I would like to knit with. Now that I've been knitting for years and I have developed a sense of what I enjoy and what I like, I really have a profile now of like non-superwash natural yarns, and I really like to work with color and neutrals. That really helped me build a stash that excited me to knit. And especially recently when I organized my stash, I let myself label some yarn as just stash yarn, meaning it does not have a project tied to it. It's just there. That way I can be inspired and possibly be able to just cast something on that comes out if I have the perfect yarn for it. And I just feel like that's really going to facilitate some creative knitting on my part. So that's something that has helped me tremendously. I tried to stick to more classic yarns, like nothing flashy, nothing out of the usual for me, like things that I knew that I already liked. Like I bought a lot of Lion Brands local, and I love that yarn. If you're a newer knitter, it's going to take you a while to discover what you like. And that's one of my suggestions as a newer knitter, is to not go out and buy a stash quantity of yarn because your preferences are going to change wildly. When I first kind of got into knitting again after my like 10-year hiatus, I was really drawn to like superwash yarns because they're so soft. Through time and working with those yarns, realizing that I much preferred non-superwash natural yarns. And that's something that only happens with experience. If you already have a huge stash, maybe enhancing your stash means just organizing it and clearing out some of the things that no longer excite you. That way you can make room for new yarn that does. Tip number 4 is flexibility. And this is pretty prevalent in 2025 for me. I actually made a make 9 for 2025. And although I did complete some of the items, there are some things that I took a 180 turn from. And I just feel like being able to be flexible has helped with my knitting output as well. If I would have been like rigid to those 9 ideas that I had, I think that would have slowed me down because I just wasn't in the mood to do those things or whatever happened. And just being able to pivot into something else, I think will help your knitting output. So give yourself permission to be flexible. A pattern that you have in mind and you have yarn for may not work out. A lot of times you swatch and you can't get gauge or you don't like the fabric. You need to be able to pivot and either find a new pattern or set that yarn aside and go find yarn for that pattern. If you bought yarn and you wanted to knit a sweater this winter and all of a sudden winter is over and you no longer want to knit that sweater, it's fine. You can knit it next year. You can knit it early in the fall next year. It'll still be there. I find that this happens to me a lot in the summer. I get really into summer knitting and then there's like a hard line of where I'm like done with summer knitting, and it'll still be summer here in California because the summer never ends. But I will have shifted into fall knitting and I no longer want to knit summer things. And that's again where I will put a project into hibernation. And then when I'm ready to knit warm weather knits, maybe in the spring, it's like I have a tee or a tank top that's halfway to 3/4 of the way done. It's awesome. It's like, oh, let me just finish this knit real quick. You weren't going to wear it anyways, so it's fine that you are being flexible and being able to knit what you're in the mood to knit. My last and final tip on how to increase your knitting output is to get involved in the community. And that can be through a knit along or through a buddy knit. I found this year that participating in multiple knit alongs, as well as hosting my own knit along, really helped me to progress on some of my whips. Or say you have something in your favorites you've been wanting to knit, and there's a knit along, like the Stornoway knit along this year. That was a project that I had in my favorites, but I didn't have yarn for and I wasn't really planning on casting it on. But because everyone else was doing it, I wanted to too, and I wanted to be part of the community. So I do feel like participating in knit alongs can be really useful to get that mojo and knitting going. It doesn't have to be a complete 180 of like casting on something new. Maybe it's a vaguer knit along, like the upcoming knit along that Handmade by Gib is hosting called the Granola Girl knit along. You do not need to make a specific pattern. You can just make something that feels crunchy or granola-y to you and submit it into her knit along. So that's a great way to keep motivated without having to knit a specific pattern. Some upcoming knit alongs that I plan on participating in is the Granola Girl Cowl by Handmade by Gib. I also plan on knitting a jaunty shawl with the Andrea Mowry jaunty shawl knit along that's happening through like half of the year next year. And then I also want to work on one of my current whips as part of the Neck Things knit along that Stitches and Starlight is hosting. And I just feel like that'll motivate me to finish a whip that's been hibernating for a while that I really want to finish. You can see that the knit alongs get me excited to finish some of my projects, which really incentivizes more knitting, and then you get your projects done faster. Another experience that I am really enjoying this year is buddy knits, and that is something you can do with your friends online or with people in person. Is you knit the same item, and because you guys are both knitting it, you're sending each other pictures, you're rooting each other on. It'll just help to get that project done, and you'll feel more motivated to do it. So those are all of my tips on how to increase your knitting output. Let me know in the comments below if any of these tips are speaking to you and if you plan on trying any of them out, or if you are already doing some of these things. I love hearing what works for y'all and what you are excited to try out. So let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. We have fun here. It's like what every manager says when you get a job and you're like, we're not going to have fun here. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye. Cookie time. Cookies are for closers. I'll go cooking.